he's a,
You're good to go.
So Walter Hickey, who is a past president of the Lowell Historical Society, archivist, and all around great guy.
I think you're on, Walter.
That's it?
Yeah.
Thank you, Eileen. In addition to all around good guy, for those of you who really know me, I am hung up on the 19th century. I love 19th century Lowell. You can keep the 20th century unless there's a good scandal involved. And someday I'll tell about those. I think everyone here is familiar with Ladd Whitney. I'm going to throw some names at you at the beginning. If you know the name, quick show of hands. Luther Ladd, Addison Whitney, fine, hands down. Charles Taylor. Sumner Needham. Well, you better know it. You live with me. John Adams. I'm sorry, John Ames. Okay, we're going to stop there. Up until a few years ago, I would have been right with you in knowing Ladd, Whitney, and Taylor. I had never heard of Sumner Needham for one very simple reason. He was from Lawrence. In Lowell, we don't talk about the ones from Lawrence. We talk about Ladd and Whitney, the two Lowell soldiers who were killed at Baltimore on the 19th of April, 1861. We also talk about, to some extent, the other plaque that's on this monument. And in case anyone here might be wondering, Ladd and Whitney are physically buried on that lot in front of Lowell City Hall. When the bodies were returned from Baltimore, they were first interred in a temporary lot at the Lowell Cemetery. And then they were shipped up to their homes. After the state and the city got together and erected this monument, the bodies were dug up, returned to Lowell, and they've rested here ever since. Around 1910, a plaque was added to it. I'm not going to show that today. Commemorating Charles Whitney. This is the painting that hangs in the Massachusetts State House, representing the Crack Street riot on April 19th, 1861. The Lowell Regiment, the 6th Mass, was comprised of 8 companies of militia. These were not trained soldiers. They had minimal training. And of course, they never expected to go to war. As they got to Baltimore, because the train did not run directly through Baltimore to Washington, they had to get off. Go about a mile across town to the Southern Railroad station, retrain, and continue on. But those two stations were about a mile apart. The Lowell companies, of which there were 4 of them, were at the very end of the line of march. And that's why most of the casualties are going to come in that company, particularly for Lowell, the City Guards, Company D. The other gentleman in this picture, whoops, wrong one. What the heck? Eileen, a bridge of hell. I killed Zoom.
I don't know how you got yourself out of it.
I hit a wrong key on this. I'm out of the program.
Yeah, hold on.
Go back to F5. Well, you can stay with this one for now, as long as the program is back.
Yeah, you have it. You're good.
Ready to do full screen?
If you can go larger, because I'd like to read part of this to you. And I don't like to read to an audience, but I will. Let me see if I can do it from here. All right, is my clicker now operating?
Slideshow. Well, if your clicker's doing something.
Okay, stop right here. Early in 1862, a group of Lowell residents sent a petition to the Massachusetts legislature requesting compensation for two of the men who were wounded. And in the course of that, they also mentioned a soldier named Taylor, it is supposed, was also killed. A stranger. He enlisted in Company D, the Lowell City Guards, when quartered in Boylston Hall in Boston. Tuesday evening, April 17th, and marched bravely with them without uniform other than a military overcoat. Strange to say, nothing can be ascertained of his origin, friends, or place of residence, and even his name is uncertain. Ladd, Whitney, Taylor, Ames, and Coburn, all of Lowell City Guards, and the blow fell heavily upon that company, many of whom, as well as the other companies, were severely but not permanently injured. Taylor, to this day, remains a mystery. Around 1910, they thought they had located his grave in Baltimore, and the colonel of the regiment went down to Baltimore, and Jones, I think, was in his 80s by then. And they dug and they dug. They could find nothing to indicate a body was in that lot. All they know is that he died there, but he is still a mystery man. What first struck me as a little strange with this is that literally he walked in off the street. These guys are going off fully armed to Washington in response to Lincoln's call. And they just let him join the company. Now, the Massachusetts State Archives has what is purported to be Taylor's musket, which was presented back to the 6th Regiment Association in 1880, 1881, and then given to the state for safekeeping. I've handled that musket. We're not sure it's his musket, because we have a statement from someone who found it in Baltimore that Taylor's name was scratched on a breastplate. No name scratched anywhere on this musket. So even what is called Taylor's musket is a big question. Is it actually his? One possible feeling I have is that he may have brought his own gun with him. This is what started me on this whole thing. I was going through the newspapers one day, and I used to pick a year at random and just sit down and go through the pages. And I came across in 1863, Sergeant J.E. Ames died this morning at his residence in this city, aged 33 years. He was a member of the 6th Regiment and was seriously wounded at the memorable riot in Baltimore in April 1861 by being hit with a stone on the back of his head. Hit with a stone, picture a paving block. This is not a little pebble they could find in your garden. He lay at that time for 12 hours in a senseless condition and never recovered from his injuries. His hair came out and his spine was ever after affected. Dropsy supervened, at which finally, after much suffering, released him from earth. My thought when I first saw this is that he's the 5th man killed at Baltimore. It just took him 26 months to die. And that is how this whole thing developed, because once I found this, I started looking at other things. This is his stone in the Edson Cemetery. The inscription on the stone is Orderly Sergeant Company D, 6th Regiment, Mass Volunteers. Died June 2nd, 1863, from wounds received while passing through the streets of Baltimore, April 19th, 1861. My wife and I spent considerable time at the cemetery cleaning that stone. It was not as white as you see it now. And in April of 2021, on a Sunday morning, we were back at the cemetery, one of the last cleaning trips. And all of a sudden, Karen says, "You do know this is the 160th anniversary of Baltimore." We were there on April 19th. Twilight Zone. I am convinced with a lot of these things, someone's guiding us. These are the wounded. Gordon and Sweat were in Company A. Stinson, I have a typo there because he wasn't in Company, he was in Company C. All the rest were in Company D because they were the last companies in line of march. In blue, Ladd, Taylor, and Whitney killed at Baltimore, and I only concentrated on the Lowell men. I'm not touching the Lawrence or the Stoneham or the Groton companies at all. There were three other notations there in yellow, which become important. John Haynes left at Baltimore. Edmund Colbert, who's also Edward Colbert, left at Baltimore. William Patch left at Baltimore. And Daniel Tyler was also left at Baltimore. Two other notations. Charles Stinson was simply sent home. This thing.
There it goes.
I can't get it to go on the screen. Oh. Third from the top, John Sweat. He was in Company A, struck on the head and back of the neck by a stone or a brick. And in quotes, first man wounded. Come down your list, and you're going to see Charles Chandler about in the middle of this page. You're going to get more on Chandler later, but also has the notation, first man wounded. How can you have two first men wounded? Chandler's comment about being the first man wounded is from his personal statement in his pension applications. Sweat's statement about first man wounded was found in his obituary. So it was a family story, I think, that he was the first one wounded. And he's buried in Riverside Cemetery in Chelmsford. Chandler is buried in the National Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio. Most of the injuries that you see caused by thrown rocks, bricks, mostly head injuries. Lamson was struck on the back of the head and eyes, quite seriously injured, but he continued on with the regiment to Washington, D.C. As a result of the petition that was submitted to the state legislature on behalf of Ames and Coburn, the legislature passed a resolve granting $390 to Sergeant Ames. This is in 1862, about a year after the riot. $390 in 1862 is a substantial amount of money. Coburn, who was also seriously injured, this is outlined, that's all right. This is Coburn's gravestone at the Sherman Cemetery in Tingsboro. This is his military history. Now, he was seriously injured at Baltimore. He was shot 3 times, struck in the head, struck in the side, And he was left at Baltimore. He returned to Lowell about a month afterwards. Despite this, in August of 1862, he re-enlisted into the 33rd Infantry. And he was very quickly discharged for disability. He couldn't do it. So he didn't give up. And he was transferred in June of 1864. He went into the Veteran Reserve Corps. The Veteran Reserve Corps during the Civil War was for injured soldiers for non-combatant duty, wagon drivers, stewards, free up other men for combat duty. But he kept trying. And on the records of 33rd, he's listed as Edward Colburn. Edward, Edmund, depends what record you look at. It's the same man. 3 head wounds from stones, gunshot wounds to his groin and left arm. And as a result of the petition to the legislature in 1862, the legislature also passed a resolve granting him $306 for his injuries at Baltimore. Again, a substantial amount for the time period. Mr. Chandler. When I was working on this and really got into it, I contacted a friend of mine who had just retired from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I had just retired from the National Archives here in Waltham. And I asked her who she could recommend to do some research for me. So she recommended herself. And over the next several months, she sent me all the pension and military papers on all of these men that I asked for. Chandler's file runs close to 800 pages. Many of these, and this is true for a lot of the others, is when they applied to have a pension reinstated. Colburn got a pension for his actions in Baltimore. But then when he rejoined another regiment, the pension stopped. When he finally gets out of service, he has to apply to get his pension reinstated. All kinds of paperwork. To get a pension from the pension office was like pulling teeth. But Mr. Chandler, I don't know if you could read this in the back of the room, so bear with me. Got a pistol shot across the forepart of his head, wounding him slightly. Struck by a brickbat on the back part of his head, laying it open and breaking the skull. Slightly wounded in the right knee by a bullet. Seriously injured by a paving stone which struck him on the lower side of the joint of the left knee, breaking and displacing the cords and leaving him permanently disabled. Sounds like a torn ACL that never got repaired. But Mr. Chandler, at the time, had been living in Lowell with his mother, and they did not have a lot of money. She earned a little bit working as a nurse, and he supplemented her income and support by peddling popcorn. When the regiment left Lowell and ordered to Boston, he went to Boston. His intent was to sell popcorn to the crowds, but he had a whole basket of popcorn with him. He had promised his mother that he would not enlist. Obviously, I think that promise got broken. And he would not leave her alone. But when he got among the soldiers of the 6th Regiment, he recognized in the ranks of the Lowell Company many of his old friends, and particularly Ladd and Whitney. Guess what happened? He joined up. He could not resist the call, and he tossed his popcorn to the crowds. What struck me when I first came across this is this is the second instance that we know of somebody who walked in off the street and was admitted to the regiment. So he goes from popcorn seller to soldier. And he was only, I think, 19 years old at the time. Most of these were young kids. Chandler was troubled for the rest of his life by those injuries. He tried re-enlisting a couple of times, again, always discharged for disability. Eventually, around 1900, he's admitted to the Soldiers' Home in Togus, Maine. Togus was the first national home for disabled volunteer soldiers. Eventually, there were 13 of them around the country. And Chandler was in 4 of them. They could leave whenever they wanted, as long as they had their discharge papers, go to another home, sign in. And he finally dies around 1915 at the Soldiers' Home in Danville, Ohio. This basically is his history. Great personal history, great military history. The unfortunate part about this is, I don't like this thing on this. They listed all his effects, the cash that was found. No relation or friends notified. He died alone. Several years ago, when I first became aware of the Togus records, I went through about 20 rolls of microfilm through the Latter-day Saints looking for Lowell connections. And there was one man, I don't remember his name, like an idiot, I never wrote it down. However, I'm not going to go searching through 31,000 records again. Every one of these, when they're admitted, they have to give a statement of their physical condition. Family, relatives, who's your next of kin? Out of all those 30,000 plus soldiers, there was one man. Notation from the clerk was not a friend in the world. And to make it worse, the guy had been born in Germany. Wounded, disabled, Civil War veteran. And if I ever got a chance to do anything, the title would be Not a Friend in the World. Chandler is buried at the National Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio. This is his tombstone, his grave marker. And you can see in the background the same grave markers. It's a veteran cemetery. What struck me about it is how clean they all are. You don't have the growth of mold and acid rain. There's a woman in the story. Her name is Adeline Tyler of Baltimore. Adeline Blanchard was born in Billerica, Massachusetts. She married a man named John Tyler. They moved to Baltimore. He became a very successful businessman. And upon his death, she stayed there. She worked as a nurse in the Episcopal Church. When the riot broke out, and she was notified that men had been seriously injured, and according to one account, particularly Massachusetts men, she went to the police station because that's where the injured were taken. And she saw many men lying around with bandages, but there were 2 men that she insisted on taking with her back to the medical home. One was suffering from a grievous head wound. That was John Ames. And the other from serious leg and back wounds. That was Edmund Coburn. She treated them basically for 1 month before they were well enough to be sent back to Lowell. As a result of that, there was a petition presented to the Massachusetts legislature basically saying, please honor and recognize this woman for what she has done for our soldiers. And in an official resolve, this communication was sent to her and to the state of Maryland. She eventually went on during the war, and she took charge of a couple of Union hospitals for soldiers. Also, as a result of Baltimore, and all this comes from finding one death notice. In 1862, the state of Maryland appropriated $7,000 to be given to the governor of Massachusetts for him to distribute as he saw fit to the Massachusetts troops who were wounded at Baltimore and to the families of the deceased. Of the Lowell men, John Ames, having previously received $390 from the state of Massachusetts, was given $1,200. Well, he's never going to spend a penny of it. It's all for his medical upkeep. Chandler received $400. Coburn, wounded severely, $750, over and above the Massachusetts appropriation. The families of Luther Ladd and Whitney also received monies, $300 and $600 respectively. William Lamson, who was a sergeant in Company D, was awarded $300. And then you have minor awards of $50 to other men on the list. Out of the $7,000, $4,500 was to Lowell soldiers. When a soldier or his widow applied for a pension, the pension office would send that application to the office of the Adjutant General to confirm the man's military record. Did he serve? Was he honorably discharged? And those 5 words came back to haunt many of the families. Because when the Adjutant General's office called for the military service record of the 6th Regiment, and they turned to John Ames, for example, the final notation on his file is left at Baltimore, not mustered. In other words, as far as the United States government is concerned, he never served. The problem arose in that all these men, excuse me, were enlisted, excuse me, in the Massachusetts militia. They were not mustered into federal service until they reached Washington. They're still in response to the president's request for troops, but they're state troops. They don't become federal troops until basically they take the oath in Washington. So as of April 22nd, everybody who made it to Washington is mustered into the federal service. Those guys who weren't there, not mustered. In other words, they don't exist. We have no record of this man. Denied the pension. Because of this click in the law, here's the pension application index card for John Ames. Widow is Julia A. His service was Company D, 6th Mass Infantry. And the first line you see there in 1862 is the invalid, that's not invalid, it's the invalid, Ames, submitting an application for a pension. Now, he doesn't die until 1863. Look at the next column to the right. Is there a certificate number? And if not, why not? He wasn't mustered. The Adjutant General's office says, we have no record of him. Julia, in October of 1864, submits an application for a pension, and finally she gets it in 1864. And again, the newspapers come in handy. Because in April of 1864, we find this little news blurb, pension to be granted. The United States House of Representatives has passed a bill giving a pension of $8 per month to the widow of Sergeant John E. Ames, who was wounded in the Baltimore riot and who died about a year ago. He was an invalid from the time he was injured until his death. This is April 1864. Let's go up to May 1864. Meanwhile, the bill has gone from the House of Representatives to the Senate. The bill granting a pension to Julia Ames, widow of Sergeant Ames, passed in the Senate yesterday. So the way to obtain a pension is to go before Congress and get a private bill. Congress is bypassing the pension office. Congress is ordering that a pension be paid. And $8 per month, that's a standard pension for this time period. $8 today, you know, that won't get you. And we're going to wrap this up here in a couple of minutes. I'm not going to flip back. I'll just tell you about it. On the grave marker of John Ames, his reference to Baltimore is right on the front of the stone. There is one other grave marker in Lowell, of which I am aware, that references the man's service in Baltimore. And that's on one of these stones right here. Would you want to take a guess which one? If you go to the Lowell Cemetery, when I was first talking to Lou Karabatsis about this project many, many months ago, he first commented, he said, "Oh, are any of them buried in the Lowell Cemetery?" And I said, "No." Well, then I rechecked my notes and I called him back and I said, "Yeah, there is one." Major William H. Lamson. Lamson had a very extensive service record after Baltimore. And on the reverse of this stone, he was one of the first to obey the call of his country and was wounded while passing through the streets of Baltimore. That's the very opening statement. He afterwards served as first lieutenant, Company D of the 26th Mass, and then he was commissioned as captain in Company F of the 33rd Mass. And while in Company F, he was promoted to major. He eventually was sent home on a medical furlough, and he just never returned to service because the sickness of the disease, dysentery and diarrhea, killed him. I will also state that his stone did not always look like that. That's a lot of cleaning. And finally, here's an abstract of his service record. One of the things that struck me about finding that obit is that everything that led to. I had never heard of Ames, Coburn, and all of the others. I had never heard of the Maryland appropriation. And just one thing led to another, to the point that I now have, I think, 6 document boxes at home filled with their pension files. It's a lot of paper. And that, in a nutshell, and I haven't covered all of them, I only highlighted 3 of them, is part of the story beyond Ladd Whitney, the wounded of Baltimore, that to my knowledge, nobody today has ever heard of. It's very popular at the time in the sense that it was newsworthy. People tracked them, but you never hear them mentioned. All the attention in Lowell is Ladd Whitney and a reference to Taylor. If you go to Lawrence, to Bellevue Cemetery, up on the top of the hill, it's a marvelous monument to Sumner Needham, which at one point had a cannon mounted on top of it. The cannon is gone. I'm willing to bet that pretty much in Lawrence, the only man that really gets mentioned is Sumner Needham. There's a notation in the 1865 Massachusetts state census. And I think I want to credit Eileen for first calling this to my attention. Under the occupation for Hannah Needham, quote, widow of the martyr. They weren't forgotten at the time. Unfortunately, with the Ames Memorial, I've been working a lot with records at Edson Cemetery. And around 1989, 1990, there was an episode of vandalism at the cemetery. And there was something mounted on top of his monument, which was knocked over. And the cemetery notation on the monument is that it was 9 feet tall. What's there now is about 4 feet. So I'm assuming it was a pinnacle spire of some sort. But that, in a nutshell, is my abbreviated version of Beyond Ladd Whitney.
Who was it that did this?
Oh,
Picture is that?
okay. Hey,
Walter.
Was this on April 19th, was it a one-time incident?
oh, it was one time, they were passing through Baltimore.
Right,
They were going from one railroad station a mile away to the other one.
right. But in other words, did it occur on other occasions with other soldiers coming in that we know of?
Not that I know of.
General Papa occupied the city.
After the regiment reached Washington, fine, they're all set, they're out of the way. But when more troops came into Washington, the 6th under Butler was transferred back up to Baltimore. And now they are in a position to put this down. Also, the Baltimore authorities were very good about not letting this happen again. To my knowledge, this is the only incident of this type.
Any arrests made at all that we know?
There were arrests. I don't know what the disposition was on those. Because frankly, I didn't care about Baltimore. I did find one interesting thing with this. The other day, I was reading an article that was published by the Library of Congress on Adeline Tyler. And he had access to her papers at the Maryland Historical Society. Now, everything I have ever read, everything that's in the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors references hit on the head by bricks, by stones. Her notation makes specific reference to shards of broken glass in his neck. So he would have also been hit or struck by a bottle of some sort. I do know that among the Baltimore, the rioters, I believe there were, I think 10 or 12 casualties because the Massachusetts men did fire back.
Think about that.
Who were killed, were they also coming from the rioters, were all the weapons handheld projectiles or was there any gunfire going?
There was gun, well, Coben got shot 3 times,
They were shot too.
shot across the scalp. So there was gunfire from the rioters. But there was also gunfire back from the 6th Mass into the mob, once they were fired upon.
And a very specific question about Mr. Colbert, because we have that slight discrepancy in the first name. I'm just wondering how solid the evidence is that they are in fact the same. And the reason I ask is I grew up in Drake and I'm familiar with the history, and I know that frankly Colburn's come a dime a dozen in that town. So
Coben's a dime a dozen,
Colburn's.
it's more like 150 per dozen,
Fair enough.
per dime.
Fair enough. But you get my point.
Yes.
A lot of Colburns, and I just didn't know.
It is, he's the same man. And I cross-referenced that by looking at the military record, because they're online, under Edmund Coburn and then Edward Coburn. I'm gonna get these two mixed up off the top of my head. One of them lists all his service. The other one lists only his service in the 33rd Mass with the exact same dates and exact same information. So it's whatever was written down on a daily report or on an injury report, but it is the same man. And if it wasn't, I'd lie and tell you it was anyway. Phil,
you have very specific dollar amounts in there. I wonder if is there any rhyme or reason? They're all over the place and some of them are odd amounts. Is there some kind of formula they use?
I can't answer that.
You don't
I'm
know
sure
how
the
they get
governor-
numbers?
I'm sure in his wisdom, the governor of Massachusetts had some justification for the dollar amounts that were awarded to the individuals. But what that formula was, I have not seen any reference to that. And those were reported in the newspapers, but they were also in the original manuscript papers held at the state archives. But what the judge, what the value was in terms of who gets what,
Yeah.
I have no idea. Can't answer that.
Curious.
I'm frankly a little surprised that Maryland was willing to help Massachusetts.
Say what?
I'm frankly a little surprised that Maryland was willing to help Massachusetts to that extent, because even though they officially didn't secede, I know there was a lot of pro-Southern sentiment.
There was a strong pro-Southern secessionist sentiment in the state of Maryland, which is why there were federal troops quartered there throughout the war.
Right.
But there was also a strong Union sentiment. And the governor of Maryland and the legislature of Maryland were strongly Union sympathizers. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But yeah, there was always, Maryland was always a questionable state, right through the war. But there was enough sense of responsibility and strength to the Union that Maryland did appropriate that money. And it was no strings attached. Barbara,
This riot, was this an ambush or did it rise up as,
oh, it was an ambush.
so it was organized?
It was organized, and then as what happened, most of the troops got through. They got through their train, but the last ones, they had to walk through. That gave the secessionists, the rioters, ample time to gather up their rocks and bricks and to get more men to come and help them.
So
It
then
was an ambush riot.
it was an ambush, so it didn't come out of like mob violence. It actually, they organized this ahead of time.
They did
to
not
assault
organize
them.
it ahead of
Okay,
time.
that was.
It
that's
was
my question.
spontaneous.
That's what my question is. Okay.
It's a good question, because many riots in the
Yeah.
antebellum period were in fact organized. They weren't just
Right.
spontaneous.
This was just a riot,
Okay.
quite literally.
Walter?
Speaking of Maryland, have you ever seen the plaque in the Inner Harbor
No,
commemorating those from Lowell?
no, because I've never been there.
It was just, I don't know who created it, but it's a very strange plaque because it basically says that those from Lowell were all musicians. Okay, and when they were confronted with this violence, they turned tail and ran.
The band did accompany them, the 6th Regiment Band. And one of the things I have not followed through on this, not so much in terms of the injuries, because they weren't armed. The 6th Regiment received, I want to call it a fairly substantial appropriation. The 6th Regiment Band for, quote, damages received at Baltimore, but not physical damages to the men. And the band,
To their instruments.
well, if all you have is a trumpet or a drum, what the hell are you gonna do? I'm going the other way.
But I found it very interesting that of all the things to focus on, they focused on the band. This
Well, that's because they ran.
That's because they ran.
That's, I'm sure that's what that was, but that's a guess on my part.
There was a talk by Dick Howe some years ago on a similar subject. And I do remember specifically, he's saying that the band was at the end, the whole group, and that when they were attacked, they did run because they were unarmed.
They were
Had
unarmed,
no
right.
choice.
Yeah.
And they never made it to Washington.
Yeah, the Trump.
Many of them never made it to
No,
Washington.
they didn't, none of the band. I first found Ames's newspaper obituary. And I found what this could lead to. The first thing I did was go talk to Dick Howe.
Yeah.
Because when I worked here at the library back in the 80s, I knew that he, I believe it was on his master's thesis. And his subject was April 19th, 1861. And I did not want to replicate what he did. And he gave me a copy of it, and very plainly, we're going in 2 different directions.
Yeah.
He's talking the history of it, and it's a wonderful feed into it. It's everything you want.
Yeah.
But I was concentrating on the individuals.
No, this is all new.
I was hoping it would be new. I think this would be new to just about everybody,
This
Phil.
is really, yeah, interesting.
But I also want to mention one thing. If you have access to the Lowell Sun online or the newspapers upstairs, I will send Bridget the citation. Around 1956 or 57, Charlie Sampras wrote a wonderful column on the mysterious Mr. Taylor. Does not answer questions, doesn't tell us where he's buried, where he's from, but it's a great column of background on Charles Taylor.
I know where he's buried. Eileen.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you know that I'm obsessed with Charles Taylor, and he's buried in Baltimore. He was buried temporarily, and that's where they tried to find him years later. But he's buried with his brother and his brother's wife. And his brother happened to marry a Taylor. She was a Taylor, so that's why it gets all confusing. I mean, well, there's lots of reasons why it's all confusing.
So the grave that Jones went down to in around 1910 was the wrong grave?
Yeah, no, he was
Was
in
it the
there
original grave?
till his family started looking for him, because he's from Baltimore. He just happened to be killed with the Lowell group
In
when they
Baltimore?
went through Baltimore.
I did not know this.
I have some more stuff. I'll share it with you.
While we're on this, can I ask a question too? Walter, did you come across anything that said how the citizens of Lowell reacted to this burial? Where, you know, what is now the Ladd Whitney Monument, but them actually being buried there. Wasn't that kind of unusual?
You mean to bury the bodies in what is now the Memorial Park?
Yeah,
It was unusual, but everybody was enthusiastically behind it. Between the city and the state, they raised the funds to construct the memorial. And everything I've ever read on that, everything I've seen, enthusiastically supported. Because these were the martyred heroes of Lowell. I have never seen any opposition to it.
And its dedication was postponed due to the assassination of Lincoln.
Correct.
Lincoln, right.
But then the crowd showed up. So
Yeah.
my feeling is that from everything I've seen on that, is that the idea of a permanent entombment in a public lot was overwhelmingly supported by the populace. The city government and the populace.
Right. Well, I assumed that it had to be, but it still seemed very unusual to me. But again, as you say, the situation is unusual. And just to
situation.
remind you, we had when they cleaned up Ladd Whitney Monument, repaired it and so on, we had a very nice reenactment of that dedication. Mary Bacigalupo wrote a script, and we had, and one of the characters was the mayor of Baltimore. It was played by, I can't think of his name right now. He was the pastor at the Elliott Church, who happened to be from Baltimore himself. So there, you know, all kinds of interesting things have happened, let me just say. And I think you shouldn't write off the guys from Lawrence.
I'm not writing them off, but my concentration and my primary interest is the men from Lowell. Part of that is because I have such access to all the Lowell materials.
Right, well, you certainly have a lot of stuff.
Karen can attest to that. I've got boxes of documents all over the house.
And are you gonna leave them to the, well, I'll hold off on that. I was gonna say the cemetery, the library, the Lowell Historical
I think
Society,
I'm looking at the person.
the archive.
Assuming she wants to add about 6 or 7 more boxes of documents to what is an extensive Civil War collection.
Right.
Right, Bridget?
I always say the similar stuff. Any other questions?
Thank you so much,
all very
Walter.
Thank you, Walter. This is great.
Thanks, Walter.
And I hope I'm forgiven for not having any nymphs.